Hi, we're going to use DreamWeaver Creative Cloud Edition to create a layout using primarily CSS, cascading style sheets, along with div containers and HTML tags. We're going to build one from scratch. We can find plenty of templates that have everything set up for us, but this tutorial is designed for people who are interested in creating something from scratch. It's going to be a very simple layout with a header, main section, and a footer, and maybe a couple of boxes in there. We assume at this point that you have some basic understanding of CSS and how it works, and that you have access to Adobe Creative Cloud Edition, specifically the DreamWeaver application, which we'll be using to create our layout. We're going to start with a blank slate. Everything's fresh and new, default settings. What we want to start with first is to create a work area for our files to go into so that we can find them later and manage them a bit better. To do that, we're going to create a new site by clicking on Manage Sites. And here what we can do is create a new site. We'll give it a name, my CSS layout. Something simple, nothing too crazy. And over here we're going to actually create the folder where our files are going to be saved in. Now you'll notice the folder here will be depending on what your system is set up as, whether you're working on a Mac or a PC. It doesn't really matter. What does matter is that you know where this folder is being saved. If you click the little folder icon, you can actually browse to somewhere on your computer and choose a specific folder. I'm going to just put it in my default folder in my documents, and I'm just going to change the unnamed site to CSS underscore layout. Try not to put spaces in your file name. Sometimes it can make things complicated when publishing to the web. But for the most part, just keep it as simple as possible and off you go. So let's click Save here. So now we have here in the list my CSS layout. Nothing else to do for now. We're just going to click on Done. There you go. So now we have an area here. Notice if it's a little cut off, the text, you can move these little bars up here at the top so you have more space for your main. And if you hover your mouse over this area, you get details as to where your files are being saved so you can find them at any time if you don't remember. Now the first thing we want to do is create a new file. So we go to File, New. And you have a lot of options here, but again, we're going to keep it plain vanilla. New document, of course, an HTML document, which is pretty much a web standard. And here, where on the right, you have an option for framework. We're going to go with none. We're not going to start with anything pre-built for us. Let's give our document a title, my CSS layout. We're going to be working in HTML5, the more recent edition of HTML, which is really great to work with, really fun, and very forgiving in terms of any little glitches and errors. Plus, it has introduced a whole bunch of new features which are very cool and we'll be exploring in this tutorial. Now, we're not going to be attaching a CSS file to this particular one. We're not using an external style sheet as one of the 3 ways of working with CSS. What we will be doing is just keeping all the CSS internal to our document. So don't worry about this for now. In a future tutorial, we'll explore external style sheets and how to attach them, etc. But for today's tutorial, we're going to be working with style sheets that are internal to the document we're working on. So let's click on Create. Nothing else to do here. And DreamWeaver will give us a nice blank page. Obviously nothing there to see yet. I prefer and recommend that we work in split mode. Now split mode is good because you'll see that it creates in the lower part of my screen access to the HTML, and in the top part of my screen I have the work area, where I can get either a preview or a more visual approach to creating my page. It's nice, it gives you some feedback, you know exactly what's going on. Although it's not exactly what you would be seeing in a web browser, it comes pretty close with a lot of things. Now, another thing we'll have to look at is live view. Live view tries to emulate what you would see in a browser, but it does make editing a bit tougher. So what we want to do is switch to design view in this little drop down. There we go. So you're not seeing much of a difference here. The difference is that when you click in it, you'll start seeing a cursor, and when you start typing, it'll be a lot like Microsoft Word. Now you'll notice when I start typing up here and make selections up here, that's reflected down here in the HTML code for our document. One of the panels that's very useful to have open for this particular exercise is the Properties panel. And it's if you go to Window in the menu at the top, and the second one should be Properties, you can click there and open it up. Now, like all panels in DreamWeaver, you can move them around and break them out of the interface. I like to have my Properties bar attached to the bottom down here, and you'll see if I approach it very close, you'll see that blue highlight turn on. It means it's ready to magnetically attach itself to the bottom, and that way it's out of the way and always accessible. If you want to remove it, just grab the tab and drag it out like before. There you go. I'm going to put it down here, and boom, right there. Nice. Okay, so again, in the main area here, we can type, we can add things, and the changes are reflected down here in the HTML. And what we're going to be doing is creating a series of containers so that we can assign values to them, width and height and colors and outlines, margins, using CSS, so that we can more easily move them around and structure our document. Because right now it's a bit of the Wild West, everything's wide open. What we want to do is create a structure and then style that structure so that it conforms to what our design layout is going to be. We'll start with creating a basic container in HTML. Now you'll notice when I click in here, in the HTML, my cursor automatically goes to the right area between the body tags. This is the editable area. This is what the end users will see. Everything should be in the body. Now we can alternate and switch between visual mode and text mode. You'll find yourselves creating your own workflows and switching back and forth. Whatever you're comfortable with, we're just here to explore the main concepts of how to go about this. If you have a more efficient way of doing it, please, there's no wrong way of doing it, as long as your syntax is correct and the concepts are solid. So put my cursor right in here by clicking. What I want to do next is insert a div tag. So by clicking here on the div, at the insertion point, it's going to insert the div tag. Now, it's a great opportunity at this point. Dreamweaver is giving us an opportunity to assign a class name to this div container. The class name allows us to target it with CSS. If you're not familiar with CSS concepts and how to use them, I suggest you read up a little bit on them or follow one of the other tutorials I've created that goes more in depth and discusses the philosophy and thinking behind CSS and how it works with HTML. For now, I'll assume that you understand what a class is or what an ID is and how it ties in with HTML. If not, you can still follow along and it'll make sense because, of course, I will be explaining what's going on. So let's give this a class. We're going to call this the page wrapper with a W. Because what this container will do is restrict our entire web page to a certain width and work area. So it wraps all our page and elements inside it in a way that prevents them from flying out to the right or the left of the screen. It's a fixed width design that we're going to be doing. So we'll do that. We'll name it Page Wrapper, and you'll see why. And we're going to create a new CSS rule right away. So we're presented with this screen. As soon as we press New CSS Rule, it automatically applies the class that we've provided. And in the rule definition over here, choose where your rule will be defined. Basically, where will the CSS for this go? In this case, we're going to choose this document only. The selector type is a class. It recognized it automatically because we've named it. If not, we can choose to apply an HTML tag to restyle, but not right now. So let's just click OK here. And here we have access to a panel that gives us a whole bunch of CSS attributes that we can assign to our element, the one that we're creating now, the div tag. Now just take a quick second to see what happened. As we're clicking yes and OK and progressing, the code is being generated in our HTML over here, and our class is created, our little curly brackets are inserted, and now as we start building our style, you'll start seeing this area getting populated with the actual selectors and rule definitions and all that stuff that we're going to be choosing for this particular element. So let's start with the basics, the fundamentals, the box. What is the box like? Well, we're going to assign a value of 960 pixels. You can choose any number of units over here, but we're going to stick with 960 pixel fixed width size. Now for the height, we don't really need to add anything because this container will grow as we insert content in it, and it will get pushed down to accommodate all the content we assign inside. So if you leave the height blank. Float, it's going to be centered, so we're going to be using margin to do that. Padding, we don't really need any at the moment. So in margin, what we want to do is check the box off for same for all because we want to have different values. At the top, we want to give this container, just a 20 pixel buffer so it's not flush up against the top of the browser window. And to center it, we're going to basically tell it on the right side to provide an automatic value, and on the left side to provide an automatic value. Now what that does is it splits the difference in how much space is left over when the browser window is larger than 960 pixels, and it ends up centering it on our screen. Bottom, you can just add another 20 pixels there just for the time being. We can always change that later. And what I like to do when I'm building these layouts is either assign a background color or a border so that I can actually see it on my screen and work with it. So let's do that. Let's choose a border here. And we want solid border, sounds good. Thin, doesn't have to be super thick. And just choose a color that you can remember is being applied to the entire page wrapper. As we create more sections and boxes inside this container, we'll assign different colors to identify them more easily visually. And we can always remove that at the end. So with your eyedropper tool, click here, enter. Populates the areas here. For now, that's really all we need to do. If we click OK and then OK again, we should see something appear over here, our little container, pre-populated with some text, just so that we can have some text in there that we can give this container some height, and we can see it a bit better. And now you can either select it by clicking on it, and here you see the margins. These diagonal lines indicate the margin that we've applied. And if you hover your mouse over the area, you'll notice that the little tooltip is giving you the value that you've assigned there. So at a quick glance, you can see exactly what's going on. Now the left and the right margin, because it's automatic, when I resize my window, it automatically centers it by splitting the margin over the left and the right. Now let's take a look and see what happened here in the HTML. There it is. Here's our class. It assigned a width, a margin top, margin right, margin bottom, margin left. So automatic. And a border. Now we can continue to add to this if we desire. There's, we're not stuck with this. We can keep adding to it. There are a couple of ways. You can go straight into the code and start assigning more values. So you can say background, color, and then choose your color from here. Enter, semicolon. And now when you click back up here in your preview area, you'll notice that that color is assigned. Another way of doing it, and a tool that we'll be using quite a bit, is the CSS Designer in DreamWeaver Creative Cloud. So if I click this div by clicking one of the edges and making sure it's selected here, you'll notice in my panel over here, my CSS Designer, I can click over here to activate it. And what this does over here is provides us with a menu, a visual tool over here to modify or add new CSS. Much like the panel that we were working on here in the center to originally assign the styles, those same options are available in our CSS Designer over here. Now what I like to do is, and if you have of course the screen size for it, if you drag out your panel by grabbing the edge there, right there, you'll notice that if you make it wide enough, it will split the CSS Designer panel into two columns, which makes it so much easier to manage. Now, if you're having difficulty finding the CSS Designer panel, you can always activate it by going to Window, CSS Designer, and making sure the check mark is on, or pressing Shift F11 on your keyboard to activate it on and off. Something like this. So make sure your CSS Designer panel is on, and you'll see here a couple of elements. Let's look at it very quickly to see what we're looking at. Sources. This is where our document is reading all the CSS that's being used in it. Right now there's only one source, the style tag, which is located in our document right here. That's our style tag right here, and there it is selected. This media, the @media section of the panel, this primarily deals with responsive design. And right now, we're just going to focus on one design. We're not dealing with responsive at this point. So if you click the gray area, it should force it to collapse. It just kind of keeps it out of the way and decreases confusion a little bit. Now, selectors is a very important one. Right now we have page wrapper in here. That's the one selector that we've created. It basically reflects the list of selectors that we're creating in our CSS. In this case, the class called page wrapper. We're going to be creating quite a few more selectors, some of them based on HTML, some of them custom named, and just follow along and we'll get there. Next, on the right here, you have access to all the CSS that we've assigned to it. So width, our margin, borders, and by changing the values in this area here, for example, the background color, change to something more greenish, press enter, you can update the values visually here on your screen. Now if you want to add new stuff, okay, down at the bottom you can add more. But if you want to expand all the list options available to you in CSS, turn off this checkbox, the Show Set button, and now it expands all your CSS options that you can assign to this particular element. And there are quite a few of them, as you can see, starting with the top, the basics, width and height, but then you have a whole bunch of other ones which most of the time you'll never use, but it's good to know that they exist. Plus you get a visual cue to kind of maybe remind you of some other ones, you know, floats and clears and overflow and visibility. Those are a bit more advanced, not covered in this particular tutorial, but at some point in the future we'll be playing around with those. You're going to change, you know, font family for some text items. So lots of things to explore over here. You know, if you want to isolate top right, bottom left rather than all of the values, you can play around with it there. Background colors, and yeah, changing these values over here has a direct impact on the CSS that's generated and will reflect in your document. So right now I have my page wrapper. What I want to do next is inside this create more structure so that my document continues to provide me with areas that I can control better, and also provides me with logical areas, semantic coding as they say, so that, you know, stuff in the header area goes between the header tag. Speaking of which, that's the next thing we're going to insert. So insert your cursor somewhere inside this container that we've created. You can verify here also, you know, if your cursor is somewhere here between the page wrapper tag, you're in good shape. So now you can insert the next section, which is going to become our header. So we can insert header. What this does is we'll insert the header tag. Okay. Do we need to assign a class to this? At this point, not necessarily, because we're going to be, you know, using the header tag anyway, but let's do that just to make sure, and call this header section, just to distinguish it from the header tag. So we'll call this header section. One thing to remember for classes, it all has to be one word. You can't put spaces in your class. You can't, you know, try to avoid uppercase, lowercase, mixing things up like that. If you need to break it up, for example, to make it easier to read, you can use header dash section hyphen like this, or header section with an underscore. Just something to help you out, but please don't leave any spaces, because it'll break your CSS and you'll be getting a lot of errors. So click OK. And again, we'll be actually, before hitting OK, you should hit the new CSS Rule button, because it gives us again an opportunity to style things before we commit to anything else. So let's hit new CSS Rule, and it's going to be very similar to our previous creation. A class, the header, the name of the selector is already in there. This document only. We can click OK. And now again, we can fine-tune the attributes here. So again, we'll go to the box, because we're just building our containers now. For this one, the width we can leave blank, because its width is limited by the page wrapper that we created. So it'll just go to 100% wide automatically if we leave the default value of nothing. Height, though, we want to give it a bit of height, so we want to have some height to work with and structure our document. So I'm just going to give it an arbitrary value of 300 px. Margin, we want to give it a little bit of a margin so it's not stuck right up against the page wrapper. So we're going to give it a 20 pixel margin all around, and in this case we can leave that checkbox on because it populates all these values automatically. Border, yeah, we want to give it again solid, thin, and now pick a different color, maybe a light blue so it stands out. And click, what else? We can apply a background color here. Click the little drop down. Again, something light, we don't want it too loud. Enter on your keyboard. And for now, that's really all we need. Let's click OK. And now we can click OK here. And there you go. We've created a new div container. So let's look at that here in our code. Actually, it's not a div container. It's the actual header tag that we created. So this in HTML defines the header area of our document. But you can treat it much like you would any other container like a div. It has the same attributes, meaning that you can assign borders and margins and all that stuff. It's just more specific to what its purpose is. So the header section goes here. Again, our CSS is now updated to reflect this latest addition. So we have a new selector here called header section. And of course, the attributes that are assigned to it, the background color, margin, height, and border. As we continue building our document, we're just going to continue along these lines. It's a very repetitive process. It's not the most exciting part of the project, but a good foundation and a good document structure will pay off big time as you start building your document and making it look prettier and start adding pictures and real content. It's very important to have a good foundation to build on, and we've kind of skipped a step where we sketched out what it is we want to do. For now, we're just kind of diving in and doing this document on the fly, but the basic principles are always the same. If I want to continue building this document, I'm going to take another couple of minutes here to add some more sections. So again, position your cursor somewhere in the page wrapper container. Otherwise, you're going to start building, nesting boxes. We're not there yet. So here in the page wrapper area, the green in my version, I want to insert, guess what? It's going to be the main tag, because this is going to be the main area of our website. And I'm just going to go through this a bit more quickly because it's very repetitive. And it follows the same exact guidelines as the previous boxes we've created. So main, we're going to give this a name. So main section. Oops. There we go. I'm going to create a new CSS rule. Yeah, everything is okay. Just click OK. In the main section, we want this box again to be full width for now. Actually, you know what? Let's make this 70% wide, because we're going to add a sidebar at some point, and we're going to want this to float left because our sidebar is going to be on the right, so it should float left. Let's give it a height of about 300 pixels, so we have something to work with. Let's give it a margin again of 20 pixels all around. Let's give it a border so we can identify it more easily. Solid, thin, color. Let's make this one orangey. That sounds pretty good. Enter. And I think we're okay for now. Let's click OK and see what happens. Main section, OK again. OK. Now, it's going to look like your box is outside of your page wrapper. It really isn't. I mean, if we look at our HTML over here, the main tag is still within the page wrapper tag. So it's still all in there. But by making it float left, by pushing it left, we've created a bit of a hard to display element in DreamWeaver. So let's take a second to click on live view and see what happens there. It's closer to what we see in the browser. Yeah. So we're still seeing that element over here outside our page wrapper. Don't worry about it. It'll all come together. What we'll have to do is apply what's called a clear fix, which is a bit of a hack, but this is how it's done. For now, let's add the sidebar. So for that, we'll insert, oops, yeah, position your cursor, after your main section. And after that, we're going to insert the aside. It's a tag for creating sidebar content. So we're going to call this sidebar right, which for now should be okay. Oops. Click New CSS Rule. Might as well style it right out of the gate. So sidebar right, yes, correct. Click OK. And here what we want to do is go to box, give it a width of maybe 20%. And we want to give it a margin also, so 20% margin all around. We'll give it a height of 300 pixels. Border, yeah, let's give this a border also so we can see it better. Solid, thin, and green. Enter. And let's click OK. Are we floating this left? Go back to box and let's click on float left also. Let's see what happens, because I always have difficulty with this part. So by floating this left, it should also appear on the right hand side of this one. I'll explain that very shortly. Let's click OK, OK again, and there it is. Now with floats, what we're doing really is we're pushing this orange container here towards the left. That's what float left means. And when I create a new container, by default, it wants to go on its own line. The div wants to take up its own space, its own line. But by floating this one left also, it finds the earliest opening slot and just inserts itself in there. So both of these are floating left. But because there's space here, this container wants to fill it up. If I change this width over here to one that is too wide for this area, it's going to pop down into its own line. So let's see what happens there. Right now I have a width. If I select my box and go to my CSS Designer over here, I can see it has a width of 20%. If I click here and with my arrow keys on the keyboard, if I press up, it goes up by increments of 1. If I end up making it too high, let me go to the live view. See, what it does is it ends up taking up its own space at the bottom. So we want to make sure it can fit in this spot. If you're having that difficulty, it might be because there's not enough space. You might want to play around with that value. So again, as you can see, when you're in design view, DreamWeaver doesn't accurately display what you can expect to happen on your screen. So let's return that to 20%. Enter, and there you go. So what we're doing now is we've created the header area. This is an area where you'll end up putting your logo, maybe some blurb text, primarily the navigation bar. The main section is where your document will contain its primary information. It's, if it's a story, the article will go there. Sidebar content could be for any number of things, a list of links. It could be a banner ad. It could be a small form for people to sign up to a newsletter. Usually the header area and the sidebar repeat across all your pages. And it's really the main section that offers the content that you need. Now we're going to do one more thing here, maybe two, to build a basic structure, and that's to insert a footer. And we're also going to fix the page wrapper so it really properly wraps all around everything. So next thing we want to do after our sidebar, insert our cursor, or you could do that here in the code by making sure your cursor is inserted after the sidebar but still within the page wrapper tag. And now click insert footer. We're going to insert our footer area. Again, you know, footer underscore section. We're going to create a new CSS rule. Okay, this box is going to be 100% wide. We'll give it a 100 pixel height. We're going to give it a 20 pixel margin. We're going to give it a border, solid, thin, I don't know, bluish is good. And enter. And now we're just going to click on OK. Okay, and yeah, I mean, don't worry about this. Your document is going to look completely wacky. Now, one thing we didn't do is we didn't assign a float to this container. So that's why everything is going haywire again. If we go back to live view, it might make a bit more sense, see, because, you know, now we got these in the right place. The footer, yeah, it's down here where we expect it. But if you look at what's going on here, the little box we created for footer with a thin blue outline is all the way up here. And that's because the orange and the green boxes are floating. And now this blue container wants to go to the next available space before it floats, and it's kind of complex. There's a trick to fixing this, and it's not that difficult. We'll go back to design view over here, and for this we'll probably need to go into our code to make sure we're doing it right. Between the sidebar, okay, if you can't find it, just click there and it will select it for you in your code, and your content here for footer, you'll see it right there. What we want to do here between these two is insert what's called a clear fix, which means like a little break. It's like reset the floats so that this new line doesn't get influenced by what's going on further up, whereas these are floating. So what we want to do is insert a div, and we're going to call this a clear fix. And it does one thing and one thing alone. It just basically resets the floats so that the remaining content doesn't end up all messed up like this. So we're going to call it clear fix. You can call it whatever you like, but this one is pretty industry standard these days. We're going to create a new CSS rule that does only one thing. Click OK here. And here in the box, you're going to say clear. And you know, you can choose left because we've only floated left prior to this, but by clearing both, you got all your bases covered. And that's all you want to do. No margins, no padding, no color. It's going to be invisible, but it's going to be working to fix your layout. So let's click OK there. Let's click OK here. And check it out. Everything finally comes together, and we have a pretty decent layout with a header, a main section for content, a little area for sidebar content. The clear fix, which resets this whole area here, the floats, and now our footer knows where to go and figures out, oh, okay, now we have a full width with a bit of margin and everything. So if we view this in live view, it looks even nicer. There we go. You now have a very basic layout and structure for continuing to build on. One thing you probably might want to do at this point is delete the content for the clear fix so that it doesn't show up and it's completely invisible. Or you can leave it in there for now just so you can more easily manage it visually here on your screen. Now what you would continue to do to build your document is now you would target each section here and do the exact same thing. You would add a new container for your logo. You would add a new section here that would contain your nav bar. You can insert another box over here, and by using the widths and heights and margins and floats, you can now position things a lot more easily without messing up, you know, your entire document by inserting one thing. These sections kind of create isolated areas that allow you to work without impacting your document lower down. So, because as you saw, if you don't, sometimes you'll insert a float on one thing and your whole document gets looking very, very bad. So that's why we want to break it down to small components that are more manageable and are actually serving their purpose by having the proper tags. To wrap it up, let's take a quick look at the source code, because it's always a good idea to do that. Here's all the styles that we've created. Here's our document structure, and you could space these out to make them a bit easier to read. So the header tag, the main tag, the div, and the footer. Remember, it doesn't matter how you space these out. So here's one container and another. This text doesn't really belong anywhere other than the page wrapper, so you can go ahead and zap it. There you go, it's a bit neater. And there you go. You have your first official layout, structure that we'll be continuing to build on and making more complex as we go forward. What I highly recommend, and something we should have done way, way earlier, is save your work. So make sure you save your work. Give it a, CSS_layout.html. You need the .html extension. So let's save it like that. And again, if you do this assignment, please remember earlier on to start saving your work to avoid any headaches. Now, if you need to modify anything, remember you can select it here and go to your CSS Designer here and change properties. Now, if you notice, when you click something here, it'll appear in your CSS rules. And then you can modify everything that's available to you. That's a basic overview of how to create a very simple CSS layout using HTML and CSS. This is the first edition that I'm doing. I'm going to be redoing this and fine-tuning it, making it a bit more efficient. But in case of emergency, you can always refer to this and get going and hopefully get up to speed very quickly. Thanks for watching.